We are in the 23rd lesson in the book of 1 Samuel. Open your Bibles to chapter 13, verse number 13. We read this verse in our last lesson, but I want to pick it up again because it has to do with Samuel's reprimand of King Saul. King Saul is in his second year as king, and he has already disobeyed the Lord and Samuel to the point where Samuel is going to reprimand Saul, and Samuel is going to deliver a message to Saul that his kingdom will be ripped from him. Now, I said ripped from him. He's going to get that word again, by the way, later on. At this point in the story, Samuel is going to say to him that your kingdom will not endure. So in chapter 13, verse number 13, the passage says this: Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And as I told you in last week's lesson, Saul's sin was so bad that Samuel's reprimand revealed two things. First of all, that Saul's kingdom would not endure, and second, that the Lord was seeking Saul's replacement. It didn't mean that he had him right then. As we know, Saul is going to serve on for 40 years, and we're in the second year. Right here on the timeline, we're in the second year. But a replacement's going to be there, and it's not going to be one of Saul's sons to rule on down through the years. So I want to deal with the first punishment first. I've already said this to you. I want to deal with it again. And I'm going to say about the same thing I said last week. What did it mean when Samuel said, "For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not endure"? And I want to take you back to an example that we can grab, because the Lord has already done this in this same timeline before. Because remember, here we are in the second year. Eli is still the high priest. Eli has been warned this same warning. So let me talk about that, okay? We have already seen the Lord hand out this punishment before with Eli. If you remember, it was Eli. Eli's the high priest. He's still the high priest, but when this was given to us back in the beginning chapters here, we didn't know about Saul at this point in time, because Samuel didn't write to us about Saul, because Gad is writing to us about Saul. Okay. So Samuel, though, is writing chapters 1 through 7. So that's what Samuel's telling us. And he tells us about what happened with Eli when Samuel was just a boy. See, if you remember, Eli had failed to control his two sons. They were worthless sons, and they were acting sinfully as priests with the people. And years before Saul was king, years before Saul became king, when Eli was younger, and when Samuel was just a boy, the Lord spoke to Samuel, scared Samuel to death. The Lord told Samuel, "You tell Eli this, that his two sons were going to die on the same day, and that his lineage would be cut off, and that none of his sons would be eligible to serve as high priest in the future after Eli dies." So if you remember, Eli died on the same day as his two sons. He dies on the day, right here, on the day that the ark is captured, which happens to be the 26th, 27th year of Saul's reign. So it's still in the future from even where we're talking in this story. It's still in the future. Gad is telling us this story now, going back through the timeline, telling us this story. Okay, so what happens is on the day that Eli dies, the Lord has already got Zadok ready to become the high priest. Another person in the line of Aaron who is going to be the high priest. And by the time all the way through, from then on, from when Zadok becomes the high priest, Zadok's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, etc., all the way down even to the time of Jesus, are the high priests that serve as high priest over Israel. Eli's priestly line would not endure. It would be cut off. And another line of Aaron would take the priestly high place, and his descendants would fill that office forever. Okay. Let us just pause for a moment here and set the timing of Eli's death and establishment of Zadok as the priestly line. It occurred when, long after Samuel delivered the news to Eli. You remember Samuel is way down here, just a little boy, when he delivers the news to Eli, and it doesn't transpire until the Ark of the Covenant is captured, and on that day, that's when the action of the Lord takes place. And as we have shown to you in previous commentary here in the book of 1 Samuel, Eli was still the high priest at this point in Saul's life. Eli was alive, and so were his two worthless sons. Samuel was old and gray by this time, and he had worthless sons also, and they were still alive. Saul had been appointed king, and he was in his second year as king over Israel. The ark was still there at Shiloh. It had not been captured yet. It would not be captured for another 25, 26 years later on. After wherever he is in this second year, second year, the ark is going to be captured in the 26th to 27th year of King Saul being king. So we're in that second year. We don't know how close we're to the end of the second year, how close we're to the beginning of the second year. We don't even know that. But what we're talking about here is something that's very important. This principle is very, very important for all of us to understand. We are speaking of the principle of the timing of the Lord. He is never in a hurry. And listen, He is never tied to earth's time clock. He is tied to heaven's time clock. All accounts will be settled in the Lord's timing, not ours. Fret not. The evil of Eli and his sons will be punished years after the verdict of the Lord was given. It was the Lord's promise, and the Lord does not break His promise. And in the same way, as the promise was made to Eli by the Lord way back when Samuel was just a young man, the Lord promised Saul that his lineage as king of Israel would not endure. It would come to an end, and it will. He had Saul in a place where Saul was probably hopeless. Had Saul not committed his sin in his second year as the king, one of his descendants would have sat on the throne of Israel for all of Israel's existence as a nation. Point discovered here is this: had it not been for the Saul of sin, the kingly line of Israel would have been through the line of Benjamin, the least of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. Just as it took almost 40 years to reveal the Lord's choice to replace the line of Eli as high priest with the line of Zadok, the Lord would wait about 26 years to reveal the line of the king to take Saul's place. Not to get too far into the story, in Saul's second year here as king, David would still not be born for another 8 years. And he will be born to the tribe of Judah. He will be born in the 10th year of Saul, and we are in the second year of Saul. Somewhere in that second year. Not only that, David will be it'll be another 17 years after David is born. It'll be another 17 years until David is until the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines, And David's going to be about 17 years of age at that time. The ark is going to be returned, and when it's returned, it's going to be put into storage for 20 years. And then what's going to happen is Samuel's going to place the Ebenezer stone back where the ark is returned to, and where the army of the Philistines was defeated. And the Philistines would not have control over Israel any longer, or the promised land ever again, even though they're going to keep trying. And so the next thing they're going to do after the Ebenezer stone is planted is they are going to send forth Goliath for a one-on-one fight to the death that would once again establish the Philistine rule over Israel. And the Philistines, they thought that Goliath could not be beaten. Nevertheless, he was, by a young shepherd boy with 5 smooth stones and Goliath's own sword. The shepherd boy's name is David, born in the 10th year of King Saul's reign. And just shortly before David turned about 17, Samuel searched for him out of the direction of the Lord, with the direction of the Lord, I should say. And Samuel anointed David as the new king of Israel, and he would then show up sometime later to fight Goliath and become known to Saul. However, Saul will not know that he had been anointed the next king. At least, we are not told anywhere in Scripture that Saul knew when David showed up to fight Goliath that he was going to be the next king. Well, once again, we see the patience of the Lord, and that he works on heaven's time clock, not earth's time clock. It will be about 13 years after Goliath's battle with David that David will become king. And at this point in our story, in chapter 13, Saul still had at least 38 years to rule as king. But his days have been numbered by his sin at Gilgal, by offering his own offerings and not waiting on Samuel. Now, just to clarify the cast of characters alive at this point in the story, Saul is in his 2nd year as king. He will reign for at least 38 more years. Eli is still the high priest. He will be the high priest for about 25 years, 26 more years. David will not be born for another 8 years. Samuel has grown boys who are practicing priests, which means they are more than 30 years old. And our passage ends with the writer telling us that Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. From Gilgal, Gibeah would have naturally been the next town Samuel would have need to travel through on his way home. If Samuel was on his normal circuit, Gibeah would have been followed by Mizpah, and from there Samuel would soon arrive at his home in Ramah. Well, the writer then tells us that Samuel left Saul and journeyed on his way to Gibeah. That's where we are. And he then tells us the story of the organization of Saul's army for battle after Saul's grave sin. We are still in the 2nd year. We are in verse number 15b. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him about 600 men. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Before Saul's sin at Gibeah, he had 2,000 men with him and 1,000 men with Jonathan over at Gibeah. If you remember, Jonathan had already defeated the Philistine garrison at Gibeah. No doubt, the 1,000 men were still with Jonathan, but Saul's men had scattered, leaving Saul with only about 600 men. The Philistine camp was still at Michmash. And as we learned in chapter 13, verse 5, the text told us the size of the Philistine camp, the Philistine army camped at Michmash. That verse said this: Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. And they came up and camped in Michmash, east of Bethaven. For the Philistines, losing their garrison because of Jonathan, the Philistines wasted no time gathering forces to return to fight Israel. But they could not return to Geba because Jonathan controlled that garrison area. But they could camp at Michmash with all their chariots and their horsemen and their soldiers, like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. The number of 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, those numbers are not without controversy among most of the scholars. In fact, the pulpit commentary explains the controversy as follows. It says, But 30,000 chariots compared to the 6,000 horsemen is out of all proportion. Possibly this final letter in the Hebrew in Israel had been taken by some copyist as a numeral, and as it signified 30, it has changed 1,000 to 30,000, or simply still shin, which is what it is. The numeral for 300 has been read with 2 dots and so changed to 30,000. So in other words, these scholars say it couldn't have been 30,000. It was probably either 3,000 or 300. The Eliot commentary for English readers addresses the controversy as follows. The figure here, again, of the number of this vast army are perfectly untrustworthy. In the rolls of ancient armies, and we possess many a one in the sacred records, the number of war chariots is always smaller than that of the horsemen. Here the chariots are represented as 4 times as numerous. In the rolls of the most famous armies, there never appear anything like this number. For instance, in Judges chapter 4, verse 3 with Jabin, he had 900 chariots. Pharaoh pursued Israel with 600 chariots. When David defeated Syria, the great Syrian army had 40,000 horsemen, but only 700 chariots. King Solomon is only reported in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26, to have possessed 1,400 chariots. Zephra, the Ethiopian, had but 300 in his vast army, and the Pharaoh Shishak had 1,200. Here, the more probable reading would be 300, not 30,000. So even with the controversy, the writer was still trying to tell us that the army of the Philistines was large enough to strike fear in the army that was with King Saul. How large was the army of the Philistine warriors? It was large enough to divide into 3 companies to attack 3 places in the Promised Land. Verse number 17. And the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. 1 company turned toward Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Another company turned toward Beth Horon, and another company turned toward the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. There are 2 villages named Ophrah in the Promised Land. One was in the tribal area of Benjamin, the same area as Geba, Gibeah, and Michmash. The other Ophrah sat in the tribal area of Manasseh, and that tribal area was north of the area of the tribal area of Ephraim. It's way too far away from Geba, where Jonathan and Saul's warriors were stationed. So they're down in the one that's down in the land of Benjamin. And we've got another clue to that, because the writer tells us that it's found in the land of Shual. And that was the land of Shual. When you're leaving Michmash and you're on your way to Ophrah of Benjamin, you're going to travel north on a road to Ophrah from Michmash, and the Philistines pass through, that land that road goes through is called the land of Shual. So we know this Ophrah is in the tribal area of Benjamin. The second company was sent to Beth Horon. Now Beth Horon was located in the tribal area of Ephraim. That's north. And it was west of Geba, west of Gibeah, west of Michmash. So this second company was sent westward in the same direction as Beth Horon. It does not tell us that they went to Beth Horon. It tells us they went in that direction, which tells us they went west from Michmash over to Beth Horon. It tells us they went in that direction. Now the third company was sent to the border of the valley of Zeboim, and we've already talked about that before. Zeboim was east of Michmash in the land of Benjamin, just northeast of Jerusalem. The valley of Zeboim was the uncultivated mountaintop area that lay in Benjamin's land and the eastern part of Benjamin's land, headed towards the Jordan River. So in essence, it would have been easier if the writer would just have told us this. If the writer would have said to us, hey, this is what happened. Okay, one group went west towards Beth Horon, one went east towards Zeboim, and one group went north towards Ephraim, the land of Ephraim. All right, now if you remember this, in the tribal area of Benjamin, the town of Gibeah was the capital city of King Saul. So after defining these placements of the Philistines' armies in Benjamin's tribal area, the writer tells us two interesting situations that had developed in the Promised Land. The first was that there were no blacksmiths in Israel. Now this is kind of a side story put in here, but it's very important because it makes sense. Verse number 19 says this: Now no blacksmiths could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for a plowshare, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. All right. This issue was purposefully presented by this writer before stating the second issue, and the issue was the absence of the blacksmith in the Promised Land. Now, when did the Philistines rid the Promised Land of their blacksmiths? Because they said otherwise the Hebrews would make swords or spears. It is once again time to address the timeline of Saul becoming king of Israel. If you remember, previous to Saul becoming the king, the Philistines had controlled the Promised Land for 40 years. In Israel's sixth cycle of sin that was revealed back in the book of Judges. And at the beginning of the Philistines' 40 years to rule over the Promised Land, Samuel was born and delivered to Eli in Shiloh to live there. Just after Samuel was delivered to Eli, Samson was born sometime after that. 20 years later, the Lord called Samson to be the judge to deliver the Promised Land from the Philistines. Now, yet Samson, if you remember, was constantly drawn to Philistine women. And at the age of 40, after judging for 20 years, Samson would come and go. If you remember, during his 20 years, Samson would come and go in the Philistine area. They just normal, okay? Because the Philistines are in control. Nobody's in, the Israelites are not. So Samson takes control, and he was constantly drawn by these Philistine women. So in the 40th, when he was 40 years of age, after being there and controlling the Philistines in a haphazard way, Samson finally brought the rule of the Philistines to an end, not to an end, but to a standstill, we should say, on the day that he died, when he killed all the leadership of the lords of Israel, of the lords of the Philistines. Well, Samson was 40 years old. Samuel was a little older than Samson. Then about 10 years later, a little less than 10 years later, Samuel was the most likely in his 50s, and his sons were in their early 30s. And the Israelites asked for a king, and Saul was selected. Now, at this point in the story, Saul is in his second year as king. Samson had died a little more than 12 years before. And it was no doubt that during that 40 years when the Philistines ruled the Promised Land, before Samson brought it to a standstill upon his death, that as we have seen in this last commentary, it had not taken the Philistines long to realize that they had to regroup, and so they regrouped. And so they regrouped and they found new leaders, and they continued to threaten the Jews in the Promised Land. So they will do so until the victory of the ark's return, 26 years after this point in the story, when the Philistine rule comes to a complete end under the direction of Samuel the judge. So it was then that Samuel sat the Ebenezer stone, but at this point in the story, the Philistines are undoubtedly still in control of the Promised Land, and felt that the Israelites were in rebellion to rule when they sat Saul as king. And in the 2 years of his reign, Saul had not established freedom in the land, and the Philistines still threatened all. To keep the Israelites under control for all the 40 years plus this time after Samson's death, blacksmiths were forbidden in the land.